everyone. My name is Chase Hageman. I'm the New England Regional Director for the Concord Coalition. I'm assuming most of you know who we are, but we're a nonpartisan organization that advocates for generationally responsible federal fiscal policy. And I want to thank you for coming to Budget Chaos and Context, Fiscal Lessons Learned for a Challenging Future, which is also one of our de facto 25th anniversary celebrations. We were started in 1992 by former U.S. Senators Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman from Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Today's event is going to have lunch, which you guys are already enjoying, hopefully. And then Congresswoman Niki Tsongas is going to give us some remarks, and then we'll have a panel, and we'll call that panel up after the Congresswoman graces us with her presence up here. And I just wanted to introduce her real quick. She's the U.S. Rep for the 3rd District of Massachusetts, a seat she's held since 2007, and the same seat that was held 3 decades earlier by her husband, the late Senator Paul Tsongas. And as I mentioned, the Senator was one of the co-founders of the Concord Coalition. So without further ado, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Chase. Well, it's happy to be here, and as we celebrate the Concord Coalition's 25th year and its continued role in federal fiscal policy. And before I just comment upon sort of the history and Paul's role in getting it started, I just wanted to recognize Paul's sister, Thalia Tsongas Schlesinger, who is here. Where is Thalia?
Right over here.
I don't have my glasses on. Thalia, oh, sorry. It shouldn't be that bad. Because Thalia was very much a part of everything Paul did in terms of his various political endeavors, and certainly very much a part of his presidential campaign, and knows as well as any of us who are part of that, Scot Lehigh, who was here, and I remember covering us at certain points along the way, just how strongly he felt about fiscal responsibility and not saddling future generations with really egregious debt. So what I just wanted to comment upon was, I remember at the conclusion of Paul's presidential campaign, something I was always so proud to be a part of because of the seriousness of effort and focus he brought to everything he did. But he was really looking for ways to continue his advocacy around fiscal responsibility and not saddling future generations with great debt. And he reached out, or Warren Rudman, then Senator Warren Rudman reached out to him. I'm not sure who reached out to whom, but they decided to get together to talk about ways in which they could continue the conversation and continue to highlight the issue and hopefully force whoever became our next president into really addressing it. So they actually met here at the Concord Inn. I think it must have been around March or April. I think it was in the spring of 1992, because I remember Paul coming home and being so pleased that Senator Rudman had been willing to come and meet with him, that they were able to quickly come to some agreement around a way forward for creating an organization. And they decided, because the meeting was here, to call it the Concord Coalition, but also because of the revolutionary history that Concord, so much a part of the history of Concord. And then from there, they reached out to former Commerce Secretary Pete Peterson, who was willing to join them. And then I think they felt so fortunate that Martha Phillips, who was a Hill veteran with great budget experience, was willing to become the first executive director. And Bob Bixby has certainly continued in that vein. So I think they just felt they had a tripartite stool that would serve them very well. And I think he would be, and that certainly was the case. And I think the fact that we're celebrating our 25th year is a testament to the wisdom of those the early partnership and the early decisions that were made about a way forward. But I think he would be very pleased today that it still is continuing in that not partisan tradition, that it has really become, for those of us on the Hill, a reliable, trusted, go-to source of information as we debate fiscal policy. We always know there's not going to be an axe to grind, and other than making wise choices. And the other thing I wanted to say, I do think that your emphasis, the Concord Coalition's emphasis on educating citizens on budget choices has been a wise one as well. So as we were in the midst of the Great Recession and making extraordinary expenditures in order to stabilize the country's the economics of this country. There was a lot of rightly anxious concern about a way forward, and the Concord Coalition was putting together sort of a traveling effort in which citizens could come together and be parceled out into tables of people and have to make some of the tough fiscal choices that we in Washington are tasked with making. And I remember we held such an event here in Concord, over in West Concord. We had, I don't know, I think maybe 50, 60, maybe even 100 people show up to it. We divided people into tables of differing points of view. We didn't want all the people who believed in federal spending at one table. We wanted to have a mixture. And as I recently made a decision not to run again for re-election come at the end of next year, I got a card from someone who participated in that. And she was from Sudbury, a community here, and she said, quote, "I participated in what was the best exercise in democracy, besides voting, when you worked with the Concord Coalition to have people tackle the federal deficit. Bringing together many people of different political perspectives to actually look at and try and solve a huge problem was challenging and instructive. It taught me and my husband a great deal about our political process at a practical level." So just to say that it's so easy when you're sitting in your home to say we should do X or we shouldn't do Y, but to bring people together and have them make some of those tough choices, I think, was revealing. We also had a gentleman attend that event who has a particular, we call him by a particular name. He is not a fan of the federal government. He does not support federal spending at many levels. And he was at one of the tables, and I remember that he was actually silenced, that in the course of the discussion, he came to the table itself, and the participants at the table just sort of made it clear that you just can't be visceral about these things, that you have a lot to weigh, and that the way forward is never as simple as we would like. So this very important debate continues to play itself out. As I said, with the Great Recession, we were called upon to make extraordinary expenditures. I can remember being on the floor of the House as we were called to deal with Wall Street falling apart and then follow on the Great Recession. And, you had to kind of just make these decisions in the moment, and with the trust that they were wise decisions that would serve this country well, even though they represented extraordinary sums of money from the point of view of the average citizen, the citizen at home who's struggling every day to make their basic payments. And I do think that since then those decisions have proved us right. But I can remember going to an editorial board at the Herald here in Boston, and one of the members of the editorial board saying to me, your husband founded the Concord Coalition. How could you spend those dollars? But the reality was we needed to do it. In that moment, we needed to do it, and I think the Concord Coalition, among many others, certainly recognized that. As a member of Congress, I have been on the Armed Services Committee, again, where our most recent debates are around the unfolding need, and we can debate the merits of how much money we should be putting into our defense budget. But much of what we're seeing coming from the other side is, robustly fund defense at the expense of everything else. So as a Democratic member of Congress, I do think there are instances in which we need to make greater defense expenditures, but not at the expense of everything else. And so that's just one piece of the debate that is coming, as we still struggle with the sequester, the across-the-board cuts that were put in place a good number of years ago, as we struggle with tax reform and how to implement a tax reform that is fair-minded, fiscally responsible, and make sure that all Americans pay their fair share. Despite all the loud protestations around fiscal responsibility, we do see my colleagues on the other side of the aisle moving to something very different, in which they would put in place a tax reform package that really is designed to benefit those who least need it, and at the expense of everything else, essentially starving so much of what government does. So we know we live in constrained times, thoughtful times, How we resolve this is not yet over, but I do hope the Concord Coalition will continue to play the very important role it has played in these past 25 years of being a reliable source of trusted analysis as we debate these great decisions going forward. And I look forward to my continued service for the next 14 months, always thinking about all that the Concord Coalition did historically to bring us to a more sane place, and its continued fight to try to move us back to that kind of place. So thank you for everything you do, and thank you for those of you in the room who were a part of it early on and who continue to support the Concord Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, for those fantastic remarks. I guess we will transition now to the panel discussion, and I'm going to call up our panelists starting from this seat over just so it's easier to walk down the aisle and get seated. So Robert Bixby, the Executive Director for the Concord Coalition, will be a part of the panel. And you're not going to be able to hear Bob at first until I unplug this microphone, so there will be a transition point.
Chase doesn't want to hear me ever.
Yeah. And then we have Doug Elmendorf, who is an economist, dean, and Don K. Price Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was also the director of the Congressional Budget Office from 2009 to 2015. And Scot Lehigh will be joining us up here. He'll be moderating the conversation and also sharing some of his remarks about covering campaigns and fiscal policy issues. He's a columnist for the Boston Globe, also a Pulitzer Prize finalist in national reporting for his coverage of the '88 presidential campaign. So thank you all very much for being here. And Bob, before you say anything, let me plug you in.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's great to hear Niki Tsongas talking about those experiences with the Concord Coalition. I'd like to get the name of that woman from Sudbury that had such a great experience with us, but that's one of our favorite things is to do the budget exercise. Scott, I think maybe we can get back to me and you can start.
Sure,
and we'll
sure.
sort of work our way down. But
Thanks everyone for coming. Can people hear me? Am I okay? Okay. I did have the pleasure of covering Senator Tsongas' 1992 campaign, and it was a very unusual one. Well, all the other candidates, so you remember the people in that year, Bill Clinton, Tom Harkin, Bob Kerrey, Jerry Brown later on, to name some of them.
Check your
receiver. Okay. Any better? I'll just talk loud. While they were out there promising middle-class tax cuts, Senator Tsongas was running on the unusual in presidential politics theme of intergenerational responsibility. And he would continually say that we couldn't hand a debt-ridden world to the next generation. He liked to say that he wasn't Santa Claus, he wasn't the Easter Bunny. And then as the campaign evolved a little bit, he started to say he wasn't a panda bear. And I remember one instance where he, against the advice maybe of some of his crusty old political hands, came out and held up a stuffed panda bear and said that I'm not panda bear. And I remember Eddie Jesser, who was a longtime aide to Mayor Menino and the White House political director under Jimmy Carter. I remember Eddie coming around the corner and seeing Paul with a panda bear and going, because he didn't want the visual. But anyway, it was a remarkable campaign for a guy who tried to tell it like he saw it rather than just pass out tax cut treats. And he did not win, but he won New Hampshire, Maryland, Maine, Arizona, and Washington. And then he pulled out of the race after, I believe it was either the Michigan or Illinois primary, and his message was resonant enough that he went on to win 2 or 3 weeks later, or not win, but place a close second to Bill Clinton 2 or 3 weeks later in New York State, even though he was no longer a candidate. So, and as Niki said, one of the legacies of that campaign was the Concord Coalition, which is someone who has written about fiscal policy and debt from sort of a perspective of not burdening future generations with a debt they just can't handle. Concord has been just an invaluable resource to have. I think that that it really has been the role model for a nonpartisan, non-agenda driven, other than maybe the national sort of responsibility horizon organization. And I really feel like Bob has sort of created the role of how to fill that function. It's a place you can go for information, for explanations, for trusted analysis, and knowing that it's not driving an agenda or a set of ridiculous ideas that you sometimes find with other policy stops in Washington. So I think it's just been a huge bonus for the debate. And I, as someone who watched some of the fiscal wake-up tour, I think a campaign or two ago, I thought was really valuable in taking those lessons to America. I've often thought, we could use if we had in presidential politics a candidate like Senator Tsongas or like Ross Perot before him, or actually same year, but who would do a little more of that, more of the charts and graphs and explanations, and appeal to the better angels of people's fiscal nature. Maybe we would have a little more responsible national politics, but we don't see that much. But here we do have Doug Elmendorf with us, who is a terrific analyst, economist, has worked at, I think, Treasury, Brookings, CBO, 2 or 3 stints, and is one of the people who has done that kind of work for the government. And I'm really pleased to be here with him and with Bob, obviously.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here myself. Of course, I know of Paul Tsongas' work on the federal budget, but I recently heard of another connection I have with him. I gather he was a graduate of the Kennedy School at Harvard, and the school of which I now have the great honor of being the dean. But it's terrific to be here and to be able to recognize the work of the Concord Coalition over the last 25 years and to look ahead. Bob asked me to speak about the fiscal challenges that I see for the next 25 years. So let me make 5 quick points. The first most central challenge is the one that the Concord Coalition was founded to address and is, alas, still with us. Under current policies, the federal debt is on an unsustainable path relative to the size of our economy. And so we will need to cut federal spending and raise taxes relative to our current policies. And that imbalance between spending and revenues that leads the debt up on this steep path is not some sort of quirk of the way projections are done. Projections are uncertain, and to be sure, changes in interest rates, economic growth rates, the healthcare system, immigration, and other factors will change the magnitude of the challenge we face. But the fundamental problem, as you know, is that we have an aging population, we have rising healthcare spending per person, and the federal government is very heavily involved in supporting older Americans and paying for healthcare. So the challenge is a fundamental one, and it is still there. Tax reform, designed to boost economic growth, can play some role, but feasible tax reforms will not have such a large effect on economic growth as to make this problem go away. The second main point that I see for fiscal policy going forward is that federal policy should, in my view, be focused on increasing the well-being of lower and middle-income Americans. Less skilled Americans have not done very well over the last few decades in this country. They haven't done quite as badly as the official numbers suggest, because there are a lot of measurement problems in the official numbers, but they have not done very well, and they certainly have not done well relative to Americans who are in higher income levels, generally Americans with more education. And we see the consequences of this divergence in a number of social indicators. So we have diverging trends in life expectancy in this country, diverging trends in out-of-wedlock births, an opioid crisis. We also see, I think, the frustration playing out in our politics, and in a way that's making the politics, I think, more dangerous and less effective. So I think it is both a moral imperative and a requirement for social stability that our policies focus on helping people who are left behind. That matters for the budget, because it means, in my view at least, that we should not be reducing public benefits for people at the lower part of the income distribution, but instead investing more in their economic futures. because the underlying trends are not likely to reverse in a way to their benefit. The third point I would make about federal fiscal policy is that we need to make sure we are not scrimping on the investment the country needs at the public level. Under the current caps on discretionary appropriations that Congresswoman Tsongas described, federal investment in infrastructure, in research and development, and education and training will soon fall to the lowest percentage of GDP in my lifetime. And that is not the sort of fiscal policy that an advancing country, a confident country, should have. That is a policy, a fiscal policy of retreat. And is especially misguided given the current low level of interest rates. Louise Shaner and I published a paper this summer about federal budget policy in a world of an aging population and persistently low interest rates. And we argued that many, though not all, of the factors that hold interest rates down now suggest we can have higher debt and higher investment by the federal government than we otherwise would have. This is not a license for debt to rise indefinitely relative to GDP. It doesn't solve that problem. But it does say that we can be a little more patient in moving the federal budget toward where we need it to go, and that we should be doing extra investment along the way, or at the very least not cutting back investment relative to our historical norms. The fourth point I want to make about the future fiscal challenge involves reform of our health insurance and healthcare systems. The federal government currently pays for about half of healthcare in this country. That fraction will probably rise over time because of the aging of the population and because polls now suggest that most Americans think the federal government should ensure healthcare coverage for everyone. So policymakers need to focus on using that purchasing power to reform the healthcare delivery system rather than continuing to rehash the insurance coverage debate of the past 8 years. Exactly how to do this, how to use this purchasing power effectively is challenging, and I don't see silver bullets, but that's where attention should be directed. And the fifth fiscal challenge I would mention of the next 25 years is to fight future recessions when they arrive. Economic expansions do not die of old age. I don't think our current expansion is on the cusp of ending, but the historical record is very clear that our economy will fall into recessions in the years to come at various points. And in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, economists and policymakers learned that fiscal policy, that expansionary fiscal policy, is not the right way to address some important economic problems, like supply-driven inflation. But it is still the right way to address a shortfall in private demand of the sort we saw in 2007 and 8 and 9. And we need to make sure that that truth is not lost. And all the things that expansionary fiscal policy cannot do or is dangerous for during times when private demand is weak and unemployment is rising, we need to use fiscal policy, as the President and Congress did in 2009, to fight that short-term problem. And that is not inconsistent with our continuing to worry about the longer-term challenges. So those are the 5 points I wanted to put on the table, and I will stop there. And Bob, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doug and Scott. And one thing, as I look around it, that occurs to me is that the Concord Coalition is, one thing you can say about the Concord Coalition is that our sisters show up for us. Thalia Tsongas, Schlesinger is here. There is my sister sitting right behind Niki Tsongas. And Chase's sister, Sydney Hagman, is over there. So we are truly the sisterhood of the Concord Coalition. If we have the sisters behind us, we'll be in good shape. And Paul Tsongas would be very proud of that. I think that my own involvement, there's a little bit of irony here in 25 years of being with the Concord Coalition. In 1978, when Paul Tsongas ran for the Senate and ran against Ed Brooke, I did not vote for him. I don't think I ever told him that, but actually I voted for Ed Brooke. Back in 1991, when I was at the Kennedy School, I got some advice from people about working for a presidential campaign, and they said there's really only 2 choices that you have, because you grew up in Massachusetts and you're now living in Virginia. So you could try working for Doug Wilder, or you could try working for Paul Tsongas. And I said, that's easy. Wilder has a chance. I think I'll volunteer with him. Strike two. Later in 1991, with the Wilder campaign non-existent, I was doing a lot of C-SPAN surfing, and you forget that was before internet stuff, so political junkies had to stick with CNN and C-SPAN. And I kept thinking, I really, really like what Paul Tsongas is saying, and he, really seems to me to have the best message. And if I really meant what I, learned and said all the time at the Kennedy School about supporting candidates that you believe in, I should do something about that. So finally, I threw in the towel and said, I am a Paul Tsongas supporter. Maybe not in 78, maybe not early in 91, but certainly by the end of 91 I was. I called the campaign office, and I figured I was probably about the only one in Virginia outside of the Washington suburbs that had ever heard of him and knew how to pronounce his name. And that was probably true, and I quickly rose through the ranks and became chairman of the Virginia delegation for Paul Tsongas, and actually went to the convention that year as a delegate. At the end of the campaign, when he started talking about doing a project with Warren Rudman, I volunteered to be involved, and not thinking that it was going to be my occupation for the next 25 years. But I'm very glad that it has worked out that way, and because the Concord Coalition really does stand for some things that are very, very important, and things that Paul Tsongas stood for in the presidential campaign, and that Warren Rudman stood for throughout his 2 terms in the United States Senate. And there are things that I think are lacking today. If the Concord Coalition didn't exist, I think we'd have to invent it. Because, we talked about the need for fiscal responsibility, not for its own sake. We didn't say we should have a balanced budget just because we're obsessed with goose eggs, or because it looks neat in a bookkeeping sense, or because we have some sort of bias against the government. Paul Tsongas, one of the great lines that's guided me throughout the 25 years with Concord and other Concord staffers, is that we don't get into the debate about big government versus small government. What Paul Tsongas said is, what we should be about is you have to pay for the size government that you want. And that's really holding people's feet to the fire to make consistent choices. You can say that we should, lower taxes. You can say that we should increase spending, but you can't both lower taxes, increase spending, and end up at any sort of a sustainable future. So our goal really was very future-oriented. It was really about the future of the economy. It's not a thing of it was and is. It's not something about determining the size of government or shrinking the size of government. When Niki says that somebody at the Herald, and I know they never would have said this at the Globe, Scott, but I mean at the Herald, taking you to task for Paul Tsongas founded the Concord Coalition. How can you be against money? Well, of course you have to spend money if you're at war. Of course you have to spend money in a hurricane. I mean, this is not rocket science. It's the real issue is whether or not you have a sustainable fiscal future, not about some particular piece of spending that you may or may not like. So the Concord Coalition, our theory of the case for fiscal responsibility is that it is the best thing overall for the long-term health of the economy, and that's why it's future oriented. Paul Tsongas always said we're about generational and fiscal responsibility, and about making hard choices. It's not there aren't any magic bullets here. So you have to look very carefully at the budget and go through things like our budget exercise and see where the spending pressure is coming from, and see if there's better ways to raise revenue, and get the budget on a sustainable path, because that's what's best for the economy and for future generations. Now, things have changed a lot in 25 years. I mean, the economy has changed. The budget has changed. Things that used to be we used to talk about in the long term have arrived. The long term has caught up to us. And so I think the future for the Concord Coalition, as we look at the next 25 years, is going to be about grappling with those choices of, how do we deal with the aging population now that the aging population has, is not 25 years in the future. It's me. It's our baby boom generation. And so, how do we reorient the budget towards investment? How do we try to get some economic growth? How do we control healthcare costs? I'd say Concord's mission is to come up with what I'd call a fiscally responsible growth agenda for the future, given a changing economy. And that's going to be difficult, but I'm convinced that the way forward is still pretty much what Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman talked about 25 years ago, which is that people have to confront the facts, people have to make hard choices, and people in Congress have to work together in a bipartisan way. And there's not enough of that. There's less of that now than there was 25 years ago. But hopefully we will be able to continue our mission in that regard, and in that way help bring about a brighter future. Paul's famous quote about the Concord Coalition, when somebody said, "What is your goal?" He said, "Our goal should be to put ourselves out of business." And unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that. I think there's still a need, but I would say, in dedicating for the next 25 years, that it would be nice if we found a way to get a sustainable fiscal policy that both sides could agree in, and it would be sort of a growth-oriented, future-oriented system. So I will. And Thalia, thank you very much for coming, and Nikki, and it's I can't tell you what a pleasure, honor it's been for 25 years working with the Concord Coalition. So Scott, you want to get some questions?
I would just like, as sort of a framework for the discussion, to ask, I think everyone here is old enough to remember the last couple of times we had a budget that was in surplus, which I think was fiscal 99, fiscal 2000, the last 2 years of the Clinton term anyway. And I would like to ask you guys in broad strokes, not month by month or year by year, but event by event, but just in very broad strokes, how we went from that point to where we are now.
Well, I think part of what happened then was that the defense budget had diminished relative to the size of our economy. Defense spending had been about 6% of GDP, and it fell with the end of the Cold War to about 3% of GDP. And that freed up a substantial amount of space that was being taken up as time was going on through Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, as more Americans retired and as health spending increased. So at the time, that was not an explicit trade-off. We got lucky with defense spending. Part of the challenge going forward is that defense spending will not fall from 3% of GDP to 0% of GDP. There's debate about just what it should do, but it's not going to do that again. So we had a one-off piece of good luck that masked some of the underlying forces. We also had in the late 90s, very end of the 90s, this incredible boom in the economy. It was also a boom in the stock market, and thus a boom in capital gains, and thus a boom in income tax receipts. So personal income taxes spiked as a share of percentage of GDP, not because tax rates were raised that much in those years, but just because of the economy. So the economy's come a little bit down to earth. Defense spending stopped falling. Meanwhile, healthcare spending has risen over time, and the baby boomers have now been retiring for a number of years. So that really was the fluke, and it just it helped, but it mostly deferred the moment of truth, which is we are now in.
How much do you put the tax cuts in? How much do they factor in? We had a round of tax cuts in 2001 and another in 2002, then took back some of the
So the tax
the
cuts,
larger ones.
the tax cuts were certainly important. Some of those tax cuts have now been offset by subsequent tax increases. But relative to the projections in 2000 and late 2000, say, of this big surpluses paying off the federal debt, what happened was the economy slowed. So CBO and others were making projections then that just sort of jumped off the height we were on, and things came back to earth. But also taxes were cut, and we started fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so those factors together. The tax cuts were certainly important. If you look at CBO's analysis of the tax burden today, for people across much of the U.S. income distribution, federal taxes relative to income are now at a pretty low point relative to what we've seen over the past 30 years. I think fewer than 1 in 10 Americans recognizes that. But if you actually look at the numbers, taxes are low relative to income for people everywhere outside of the top of the income distribution, relative to what we've seen over the past few decades. So we have, on balance, lowered tax burdens, not raised them, and we've had not made substantial changes in the spending programs to cut them, and that's why the problem of 25 years ago is the problem of today.
I just add to that, Scott, that just from a political point of view, as sort of an observer watching this stuff kind of with horror, like watching a train wreck happen, because you could see it coming, that there was a feeling throughout the 90s that we had to get back towards a balanced budget. You know, there was the Ross Perot campaign and, you know, the Concord Coalition, and deficit reduction was very cool. You had lots of bipartisan plans. And towards the end of the Clinton administration, certainly in the second term, there was a competition between the administration and the Republican Congress to see who could come up with the best deficit reduction plan. That lasted for about a decade, and of course, as you mentioned, we had the budget was in pretty good shape. I think after a while, people get tired of the eat your peas sort of thing. 9/11 clearly, there was a small recession towards the end of the Clinton administration that justified the case for a tax cut. Even the Concord Coalition said you could have a temporary tax cut if it's targeted, and for reasons like that, if you get a recession. That was followed by 9/11, which said you got to spend more. You know, going to Afghanistan, you were going to spend more. We started getting magic theories then. The hard choice agenda went out the window because there were excuses. There were, you know, legitimate excuses not to focus so much on a balanced budget. But then you started having, I remember a great quote by Tom DeLay, great in the sense of infamous, about how do you pay for 2 wars? And he said, well, that's easy, you cut taxes. And that kind of magic thinking took over, and to a certain extent, we're still dealing with
Well,
it.
that actually leads me to my next question. One of the things I keep on my desktop is a story here from Reuters that says, U.S. tax cuts don't pay for themselves, Republican appointed official says. Now, the Republican appointed official in this case is Keith Hall, who now has Doug's old job at Congressional Budget Office. And normally you wouldn't think there's anything remarkable about that. If you look around the range of economists, I think in America, I don't know of anyone you would call a reasonably responsible economist. Actually, really not an economist at all. I don't even think Arthur Laffer, he of the Laffer curve and the Reagan program in the back of the envelope sketch, I don't even think he would argue that any more than the upper income aspect of the Reagan tax cuts paid for themselves. And certainly I don't think Marty Feldstein or any of the other people who were involved with Reagan would make as strong a case as he did. And of course, in those days, the marginal rates were far, far higher than they are now. And yet we are starting to see seeping into we're watching this week as Republicans are saying we are going to put forward a package, a framework that allows for $1.5 trillion, I think it is, dollar tax cut. And when people say, how are you going to pay for it? They say, well, we're going to devise the tax cut in a way that it will formulate enough growth that it'll return enough money back to the federal coffers that will offset the cost of the tax cuts, which is sort of the convoluted way you now say that tax cuts pay for themselves. But I would be hugely interested, Doug, in having you reflect a little on the government's experience with that and what you make of this redevelopment of the old supply side impetus.
Well, so my successor Keith Hall is right. Broad-based tax cuts will not pay for themselves. They may pay for a part of themselves through increased economic growth, but even that requires tax changes that really do spur economic growth. Not every cut in taxes has the same effect on economic growth as every other cut in taxes. I'm actually a supporter of including the effects of major policy changes on economic growth in the Congressional Budget Office's estimates, this thing that's called dynamic scoring. And I'm in favor of that because I think it is actually more dangerous for the official scorekeepers to just seed the field. I think there's a risk when people say, if the CBO or the Joint Committee on Taxation staff says, well, we just can't include economic growth effects. Because then people turn up and say, well, we can, and we've discovered the effect is to raise growth from 2% to 3%. I think it's much better to have the official, unbiased, skilled analysts take their best shot, recognizing the uncertainty. And I think when they get to doing that for whatever tax plan is put together on the Hill, they will find that there'll be very small net effects on growth, and that will still be disputed by people with a range of other views, but at least to provide some sort of serious anchor for the conversation that will ensue. And we also, the last thing I'd say is that we need to be careful here about how much we're seeking more growth. What the CBO or the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation will say is this policy will do this for GDP, and more GDP is generally better than less GDP. I'm all for that point, but it also might matter to us who bears the burden of the taxes and who bears the burden incorporating the effects on growth. So you'd actually like to have a distributional analysis to go with your estimate of macroeconomic effects at an ideal world, but we can't get there yet. We put those pieces together. So you would say, well, if we're going to cut corporate taxes and then leave more burden for individuals to bear, well, maybe the cuts in corporate taxes are good for the economy. Let's sort of flow that through these distributional analyses and see how it comes out on net. We can't quite get there, but I think we should be careful about viewing more GDP as the only thing one cares about in terms of the economic effects of tax reform.
And Bob, you see population limitations on age of population limitations on growth possibilities.
There are boundaries on what we can expect from economic growth, and this is, I think, really going to be an important, really crucial factor in the next several months as we debate tax policy. Is, one of the big changes that I mentioned that since the Concord Coalition started is labor force growth, which is a prime determining factor, labor force and productivity, not to get too technical here, because I'm not the economist, Doug is, but I mean, one thing that has changed fundamentally over the 25 years is we used to have, labor force growth as the boomers were in their peak earning years, women were joining the workforce, and that was helping to drive the economy. The big change now is that labor force growth has slowed substantially. That's just a matter of counting bodies. The boomers are leaving, the subsequent generations, aren't growing as fast. So just simply having the economy grow at rates that we got used to in the 60s and 70s, you hear people say, well, we used to grow at 3% all the time and we could do 4% and we could do 5%, is ignoring a certain demographic boundary that we have there. So one way you can and that will limit any sort of dynamic effect that any policy has. It actually opens up an argument for increased immigration to help with our workforce. Don't seem to be moving in that direction. But anyway, if you look at the numbers and the economics of it, that's the direction we should be going. And then the other factor is productivity growth, which, Doug was mentioning that we don't invest as much at the federal level. And that's been a years-long trend that the Concord Coalition talked about 25 years ago, that one of the reasons to get control of the budget is we don't have enough for investment. We're not investing more. So these two factors, lack of productivity or declining productivity and the workforce mean that, there are logical reasons. Doug's successors at CBO are not saying that, that they're projecting, 2% growth. They're not doing it because they're a bunch of pessimists or, gloomy gusses. There are reasons for it. And we just go out and say, well, we used to do 2% we used to do 3 or 4% in the past, and we should, do it again, without looking at the underlying, what you're talking about. There are things that I could do things 25 years ago that I might not want to do now. So, we have to look at how things change.
And let's talk a little bit about the difference between cyclical and structural deficits, which the deficit at the moment may be driven by economic conditions, and the long term over, let's say, 25, 30 years as we look out, and why they're different, and whether there is a way to sort of tame what we need to do, I guess, on the health side to tame the long-term, particularly Medicare-driven deficit.
Well, so on the first point, you're right that when the economy weakens, then less income is earned, less tax revenue is collected, and people are more reliant on government benefits, so spending goes up. So deficits tend to balloon in recessions, and that's basically good, not bad, because that buffers the effects of the recession on individuals, and also provides enough purchasing power to get the economy back out of the recession again. But that's not the problem we see going forward. When CBO or others make these long-term projections, there's some expectation that there'll be periodic recessions, but it's not a permanent recession or a permanent boom. It's some averaging of those conditions. So the problem we see is not related to the ups and downs that happen with the business cycle. Healthcare spending is a very important part of this challenge. And it's important for two reasons. One is because the federal government provides stronger subsidies for older Americans, of whom we have many more, and we'll have still more going forward. But also healthcare spending per person is very high in this country. And over the last few decades, since the Concord Coalition was founded, U.S. healthcare spending, which was high relative to spending in other countries, has diverged on the high side. So we were sort of high, but with the crowd, and now we're high beyond the crowd. And they're complicated dynamics here. Part of this is that we pay a lot per service. It's not just we spend many more days in the hospital. Every day in the hospital is more expensive. Some of that is intensity of services. In this country, you're more likely to get shoved into a very expensive machine. And sometimes being shoved in an expensive machine points out some fixable problem, and you're darn glad you did it. And many times it does not. So we are essentially paying for the ability to solve certain sorts of problems that you don't solve otherwise, but we're paying a lot for that opportunity, that privilege. That's not the way you would focus on improving population health, which is more around exercise and diet and other things. But nonetheless, it can be very, very important. Obviously, with those of us who had family members in those circumstances, or ourselves in those circumstances, we want that option. But if everybody gets that option, then we're spending a lot of money on healthcare, not other things. And we haven't really come to terms with the trade-offs there. It's very difficult to do. Any individual patient and any individual doctor will want to throw everything at a problem, and I totally understand that as a person. But if you then have the government picking up the tab for all of that, well, then you're going to spend a lot of money. So I think there are ways to make our healthcare system more efficient, and some of this is underway at the federal level. So in Medicare today, there's more experimentation with paying healthcare providers one amount for a bundle of services associated with helping somebody get through some condition, recover from some illness or accident. So rather than paying a lot of separate providers for their piece, you pay as a whole. And that has the extra advantage of encouraging those providers to work together. If you're going to get paid one fee, you have to be coordinated in what you're doing. So it has the opportunity perhaps to have higher quality care through the coordination, but also gives you then a lever for trying to control how much is being spent. There's a lot of that was has been underway partly through the Affordable Care Act and partly through other policies at the Department of Health and Human Services. I think we need to have a lot of those things. We need a lot of those experiments. Ultimately, this is up to hospitals and doctors, right, to figure out how to deliver healthcare we need more effectively. But the federal government can provide incentives to do that. And we just need to turn every experiment that we have, basically, I think we should try.
Let me ask this question on healthcare, just a little bit of a diversion, but Bernie's thrown a single payer out there as his solution to this, and it's certainly a favorite nostrum of the lefties, I think. And people point out that there are a lot of countries that get better results at a less, 4 or 5% less of GDP devoted to healthcare. I've always understood a lot of single payer. What it would crunch is basically labor income, nurses, doctors inside a system. And I'm wondering, what do you see the savings of single payer over the? I want to drag you into something here, but is that a realistic? We could do this and all of a sudden save trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars in our healthcare cost, or is it a little bit more of an illusion?
That's a reasonably broad question.
Yeah.
I think a few thoughts. One is that what other countries do in their single-payer system, quote, single-payer systems, varies a lot across countries. So there are lots of different versions of single-payer that are in the world. And we shouldn't think we can move to any of them sort of overnight and save a lot of money overnight. I think the potential for savings comes in several dimensions. One is that we might have a more efficient system in the paperwork sense. So a lot of people spend their time now sending bills back and forth between different insurers and different providers and so on. And a single system could be, if designed well, could achieve savings of that sort. A second thing we might do is we might, over time, build a system that is more focused on keeping people healthy than on getting them better after being sick. But unless we decide to start having fewer of these big machines that they can shove you into, we're not going to achieve the savings of other countries that have fewer of those machines. Part of what other countries do is they don't have as much of that high-tech equipment as we have. They have longer life expectancies in some cases because they do other aspects of health maintenance better. Diet and changes to different social structures, so you don't have as many people who are sort of falling through the cracks altogether and then end up in worse health because of that. They do a whole set of things that keep their life expectancies long despite the lower tech. That's a thoroughgoing set of changes. And another thing you might do with single payers, you might just cut what doctors get paid per procedure or what nurses get paid per shift. And our doctors are paid a lot more per procedure than doctors in many other countries. Now, we also have just an income distribution that's wider in this country in other ways than in other countries. So our lawyers are paid more than, our best paid lawyers are paid more than lawyers in other countries as well. So again, you need to think about the changes and how they would fit in the broader parts of the U.S. system.
And I think just politically, one of the things to think about, picking up on what Doug said, when we consider single payer is the trade-offs that are made in other countries, and are Americans prepared to make those trade-offs? You know, we're used to kind of a free spending system, you might say, and without constraints. And so, as a budget guy, my concern would not so much be single payer itself, but does that mean that that the country is ready to make the downside changes that go along with single payer? How do you pay for it? How do you do the sort of things that Doug said that you can make healthcare more efficient? So I think a lot of people, the danger is that people would be drawn to single payer by saying, that sounds good, I'm going to have free healthcare and somebody else is going to pay for it. And let's go into, if we're going to go that route, there are arguments for it, but let's do it politically with wide open eyes on the difficult choices. Good
piece in the Times, by the way, this yesterday, comparing systems. Right, some people I think have the impression that every other system in the world is a single-payer system, which, as Doug says, isn't true. But there's a very good piece, if you just, it's like a done by the Upshot, which is the Times' reasonably new analytic effort, that steps you through some of the trade-offs in Switzerland, France, Germany, Canada, Britain, us. It's worth reading. I just recommend people. Bob, I wanted to ask you, you've watched these, for years and years and years, you've watched these issues, you've watched what the analysts say, which I think, largely speaking, they tend to agree on the broad outlines of policy, and then you watch these huge divergent claims play out in politics. Is there a way, I mean, have we seen an increase in budgetary and fiscal literacy among the population at all, or among journalists, the people who cover it? And is there a way to get people to a basic understanding when they can say, hey, this is realistic, this is just pie in the sky?
Yeah, a couple of things about that. I think that there has been an increase in fiscal literacy to some extent with, I think journalists, frankly, cover this a lot more, and I give a lot of credit to CBO. I mean, I think that Doug and his predecessors, when budgets were big in the news back in the 90s, it heightened the role of CBO. We played them up. Certainly, the Concord Coalition uses CBO in all of our budget exercises around the country. We say these are, scored by CBO, and I think the credibility of the organization and it's just developed in a way that has really helped insiders, and to the extent that we use it in the field. It's really increased the fiscal literacy, particularly I think among reporters. Not so much the political class. I mean, I think they know it, but it's resulted in increased creativity about how to avoid it, how to get around it. So, water seeks its own path. It's kind of like, oh, well, I got this argument, I'll find another one. CBO says that doesn't work. Oh, well, I'll find something else. So I think it's created some unfortunate creativity in arguments that doesn't necessarily have intellectual credibility, but sounds, politically plausible. So it's kind of a two-front war there.
And Doug, you must watch it. Certainly during the health thing, we saw a lot of Republicans saying, well, CBO can't really score a prospective health bill because they said more people would enroll in Obamacare than did. And you talked a little about the dynamic scoring, the idea that you incorporate the growth effects of a tax cut in rather than have a static analysis. My own feeling is CBO has done a hell of a job over the years I've been following, but do you see a political effort to diminish expertise in the land?
Oh yes, I do see that effort in the land, and I think that we all need to fight that. I mean, it's not a matter of CBO being perfect, obviously. Making budget predictions is extremely difficult. CBO gets it wrong a lot of the time. But the alternative is to have no objective source of information. It is to just totally make it up. So if you ask yourself about weather forecasting, are the meteorologists always right? No. But do you check the weather anyway before you go out? The weather forecast anyway before you go out? Of course. And that's how I think about budget projections. And I think it would be very damaging to the Congress's ability to make informed choices if CBO's role were diminished. I think one should always I spoke a lot when I was director about the uncertainty of CBO's work. And I think one should always take a precise number with a certain grain of salt. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater would be a terrible mistake.
Terrific. I think that's about the time we've got, Chase. Am I right? But
let's do one more question.
I wonder if maybe someone from the audience. It's not often you get the expertise you have here with these two gentlemen, not with myself. But would someone from the audience? I see a gentleman over there who has a question he'd like to ask.
I have a question, and I haven't heard very much about it, especially from economists. How are we going to handle artificial intelligence going forward? Because that's going to have a huge impact on inequality in this country. There's going to be a lot of people who are not going to have jobs.
And if you would, gentlemen, just repeat the question so that it makes
Yes.
sense.
So the question is about artificial intelligence and its effect on inequality and jobs in the future. So part of the reason that I think that federal policy should be focused on people with less skill and lower incomes is that the underlying technological changes that have been damaging to their prospects over the last few decades will continue over the next few decades. Artificial intelligence is part of this. Just look at the prospect of driverless vehicles when we have millions of Americans without much education who are earning good livings today driving cabs or trucks or something else. And artificial intelligence, I think, also will make this problem worse for those people. And I don't think it's a matter of the number of jobs so much. We've now lived through several centuries of technological progress in which we have managed to employ everyone. It's more the quality of the job and what the job will pay. And I think that what we need to do is both to help prepare people to the extent we can to live in a more technological world. We need to increase education and training and marry that to specific sorts of jobs as they become available. It's also to make sure that private benefits can be moved between employers. So pensions need to be portable, health insurance needs to be portable, recognizing in a dynamic economy people are not going to do their 30 years at GE or GM the way they did. I think beyond that, it is having a social safety net that is strong enough to support more people sort of falling from their perches and falling into that net. And I think that can be done through clever design, can be done at reasonable cost that is not inconsistent with putting government budgets on a reasonable course, but it will take a lot of work. And I think part of what frustrates me about the debates in Washington we have about economic policy is I think they're mostly on the sidetracks, that we get totally obsessed with debates about this next year's appropriations that are really sort of fueled by just delusions about where we're going to end up. And we dissipate a year that could have been spent in a serious discussion of real issues of the sort you're raising.
Another question out there? No?
Great, thanks. Doug, thank you so much for your work at CBO. I was astonished to hear about the possible overturn of Obamacare without the CBO score. And Niki Tsongas has done a wonderful job. We are going to greatly miss her. But to have Congress vote on something without some sort of fiscal responsible knowledge, I think is very concerning. Bob, your phrase was face the facts. We are in a society today that facts is debatable, massively concerning, and it's not even really worth discussing. As the Concord Coalition, I do have to compliment on your naming of Concord. It is a wonderful foundation of all things that are good, so I applaud you on that. How can you stand up and be the adults at the table when there are no adults? We are seeing both parties pandering specifically to their populations, where this idea of fiscal responsibility should be a Democrat and a Republican one. How can you break through the noise and present that information in a positive way using CBO, but being like, oh, we're going to put this legislation through, but we're not going to wait for the CBO score yet? That sounds crazy pants to me. And so everyone mentions Trump, and they kind of laugh, knowing that there's concern. It's not a laughing matter, right? So I'm just entering my 40s, I've got some children. We've got some great responsibilities here. So that's one question. Sorry, I'm going to do one more. You were saying a little bit about healthcare costs. I feel like if you are a budgetary person, the ability to control costs is a good thing. And you can cater that towards how much money people make in different areas. But if the federal government takes more of a controlling aspect in healthcare and is able to control those costs more, in my mind, there is no greater responsibility for government than the security of that individual and life itself. Healthcare, in some perspective, is part of that responsibility.
And before you guys answer, just a quick summary of what you can. And that'll have to be our last question for the official program. But we have Concord staff and Bob and Doug. I don't know what you guys, you and Scott have to leave, but we can certainly do some more questions afterwards.
Could you repeat the question? No.
How can you be how can you get your voice out there to the general public A, for you guys as Concord Coalition and seeing the CBO score, and B, how could healthcare perhaps be more controlling of costs of the nation? Sorry about that.
Well, let me give an attempt at the first one. Obviously, that's a huge challenge. I mean, that's it. And I worry very much about for an organization that prides itself on credibility and facts, that you are seeing the whole, alternative facts. It's a universe of people saying, well, I don't like those facts, so I'll make up new ones. It was kind of like what I was talking about before. So that is a huge challenge for us. I will say that, we certainly defend the credibility of CBO, and CBO has had a good effect. The scoring of various bills, people do pay attention to, and it's caused some pause. That's why I think it's so important to have CBO continue to be the official scorekeeper, and people not attack it. As for us, I think that one of the things that's changed so much is social media, and I think that for us, it's reaching younger audiences and doing it through social media. That's, we have just hired a social media director of a millennial age, because I have no idea what I'm doing on social media, and I'm still using fax machines. So, and hiring good young people like Chase. To me, that is how we can try to counter it. But it's difficult. I'll be honest with you about that.
So my short comment about healthcare is just that the federal government, as a payer for care, can experiment in ways that are beyond any private insurance company. They also need to do their experimenting. I think we need to experiment with different ways of paying for care and find out what works to hold down costs without unduly impinging on the quality of the care that we get. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you all very much. We do need to end the program, but certainly we'll have some informal Q&A if you guys want to hang around for a few minutes. I want to thank our distinguished speakers here, Bob Bixby, Doug Elmendorf, Scot Lehigh, and of course, Congresswoman Tsongas. I want to thank you all for coming out. I appreciate your interest and support in the Concord Coalition, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank the wonderful Colonial Inn and their support staff and service staff for making this a fantastic event. They certainly gave us a great spread and made us as comfortable as possible in a great room. So just want to say thank you all. I appreciate you coming, and thanks for helping us celebrate our 25 years.